This is a show for college football sickos who want to live with on-field performance as the number one metric, not expectation. We've got a model that we built that takes into account how a team performs minute by minute in the game. You know, when takes into account when you score, when your opponent scores, how long you hold leads and give up leads for, and it gives out a rating. Sometimes we give a ton of love to the top 50. Let's take a moment to talk about some teams that didn't make the cut, but still put on, have been putting together a good season and may slide into the 50. Let's give some honorable mentions before we move on.
Let's do it. At number 69, up 39 spots in the rankings, the Delaware Blue Hens beat FIU 38-16. No one's talking about this in the S&D 50. They're just spots behind Clemson and Florida. Something to note. Here's the Delaware Blue Hens.
And this is their first year of playing full FBS football. And here
Insane.
They're sitting 3-1 and looking like they're going to contend in Conference USA.
I'm so excited. This is what it's all about. This is what this index is all about. We're about finding these teams early, the teams that are not in the AP poll. We want to give them their credit, and here it is. Up 2 spots in the rankings at number 61. The Old Dominion Monarchs coming off a bye. They're up 2 spots because Indiana throttled Illinois.
Yeah, they got a little bit of credit for that. We try to account for who you play and how you play them. So the fact that Old Dominion week 1 at Indiana put up 14 points and only let Indiana's put on 27. And then, it's 2 weeks later. They actually would have gotten more credit, by the way, if it had if that Indiana-Illinois beatdown had happened the very next week. But it was 3 weeks later that Indiana destroys Illinois, and Old Dominion they get a little bit of a bump from that. So it's a nod to the Monarchs for playing Indiana close in that opener.
Have had a tough past 10 years since coming from the FCS to the FBS. So it's good to see them start to put together a solid year and be, can we say, in contention for the Sun Belt.
Absolutely, we can. At number 59, up 2 spots in the rankings, the South Florida Bulls with a dominant win over South Carolina State, 63-14.
So I love South Florida this week. They're kind of my honorable mention because, man, if you were a Bulls fan, that was hard to get beat by Miami. So what do you want to do? You want to beat down on the little guy the very next week. And they did it just about every way imaginable. They had a 90-plus yard interception return. They had a blocked punt inside the SC State red zone. Their quarterback threw for either 3 or 4 touchdowns. They ran a bunch of touchdowns in. I mean, they were pouring it on, but all different kinds of ways, offense, defense. If you're a Bulls fan and you were at that game, that was probably a super fun one just to be at and take that in. Highlight of that one, they scored 35 points in the third quarter alone.
But this just goes to show the model still isn't loving South Florida like the AP poll is. Like, South Florida is not ranked, but they're getting votes. So if you extended the AP, I think they'd be around 30. So quite a big difference there, but yeah.
Yeah, part of that is because the model isn't that high on Florida right now. That was the kind of the marquee win for South Florida. Florida's not getting a highlight right now in our honorable mentions, but Florida's not going to be getting time in the 50 either. They're 67th. We still have them lower than South Florida. If Florida turns it around and South Florida keeps winning, they'll get a little bit of residual credit from Miami, even though they lost. They won't get that much because they didn't play them nearly as close as like ODU played Indiana, for example.
At number 57, Utah State down 5 spots in the rankings. They put a beat down on McNeese State. Once again, the S&D 50 does not reward victories against inferior opponents.
Yeah, they actually dropped in points this week, not because they beat McNeese State, but because their other games are against Air Force, Texas A&M, and UTEP, and neither UTEP nor Air Force won this week.
At number 53, up 11 spots in the rankings, Texas State with a win over Nicholls, 35-3.
Texas State is another one that they're getting more credit, not from their win against Nichols, but they're getting more credit for who they played before because they played Arizona State, and Arizona State beat Baylor. So they're getting some residual credit for having a game where they, played Arizona State decently close for about half of that game, ended up losing by double digits, but Texas State getting a bump from who they played. That scheduling matters to the S&D.
And they beat UTSA, and UTSA, as we highlighted earlier, had that victory over Colorado State.